and welcome to Conversations from the World of Allergy, a podcast produced by the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. I am your host, Rebecca Sapp. I am a board-certified allergist and immunologist, and I always enjoy learning more about this exciting field. Our podcast series will use interviews with thought leaders from the world of allergy and immunology to keep you up to date on new developments and to review core topics. Today's edition of our Conversations from the World of Allergy podcast series will focus on the topic of allergic rhinitis and the National Allergy Bureau, which provides accurate pollen and mold levels to users in the United States, Canada, and other parts of the world. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Andrew Rorie. Dr. Rorie is an associate professor of medicine in the Division of Allergy and Immunology at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He has an interest in aerobiology and is the chair of the FAAAAI Aerobiology National Allergy Bureau Committee. He has been active in the NAB, including teaching the basic aerobiology certification course for pollen and spore counters. Dr. Rorie, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I always look forward to having an opportunity to talk about aerobiology and the NAB specifically.
Do you mind if I call you Andrew?
Oh, yeah, that's fine. Yep.
Perfect. So we like to start by just getting to know our guest a little better. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and include something you like to do outside of medicine?
Sure. I'm a Nebraska kid, so I'm really kind of a farm boy at heart. I grew up on the farm in a fairly rural community in Nebraska, small town, only about 700 people. Kind of between Omaha and Lincoln. It's like the two big population bases in the state of Nebraska, which of course is generally a fairly small population. I went to medical school at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. I did my internal medicine residency training here. I went down to the University of Kansas to do my allergy immunology fellowship training. Had a wonderful time down there, had great mentors from there. Dr. Selena Gear, Dr. John Martinez were wonderful. I really enjoyed my time there. And then Dr. Jill Poole here at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, our division chief, she recruited me back to the University of Nebraska after I finished up with fellowship to help get a allergy immunology fellowship training program started here. So that was my goal of coming back here. We've done that. We just had our fourth match, which we're really excited about. We've had really great fellows so far. It's been super rewarding having a fellowship training program here. Outside of work, I love sports. I grew up playing pretty much everything: basketball, football, baseball, track. Played cornerback in college. But as I've had one birthday after another, it makes playing those sports a little more difficult. So now outside of work, I really enjoy golfing. I'm able to take my kids out and my wife, play with family and friends. So golfing is what I like to do outside of medicine.
Oh, that's great. And golfing gets you outside, walking around, enjoying the pollen.
Exactly. Whenever I go out on the course with friends, my little trick on the course, I guess, is being able to, identify everything that's out there, what tree this is, what weed that is. And I tell everyone much more than they ever want to know about the pollen from those different plants.
Do you do a weed walk with your fellows where you go out and have them identify the different pollen producers around?
Yeah, so we do a weed walk every year, once, sometimes twice a year. And then we also have another expert that comes in that helps us with the weed walk as well. So it's a nice way to get outside, really see which plants are responsible for causing, all our patients to have these allergic airway disease symptoms. So universally, it seems like everyone really enjoys doing these weed walks.
I think one of the things I learned in fellowship from the weed walk was I could identify ragweed after that. And then I started to see it everywhere. And I live in the city. And so, there's ragweed everywhere. And it's kind of shocking when you start looking for it.
Yeah, it really is. Whether or not you're walking around the city or walking down a country road, in the summer and the fall, you're going to be able to, in most places, be able to spot some ragweed for sure.
What made you choose allergy immunology as a field?
Yeah, for me, it actually goes all the way back to undergrad. I took a basic immunology course with Dr. Erickson back at Nebraska Wesleyan University, and I was just really amazed with immunology at that point, understanding, or at that point trying to understand or grasp a little bit of the complexities of it, and the multiple layers within our immune system, and how much has to go right for everything to work together, and how something as what seems very simple as a single receptor not functioning properly, and then you can end up with the most profound immune deficiency. So that's where I really kind of initially got interested, was just the basic immunology of it. And then kind of throughout medical school and residency, I had a little bit more exposure working with Dr. Jill Poole here, seeing patients in allergy clinic. And it was really then that I kind of realized that the field of allergy is super cool. You get to see kids, you get to see adults. At some points, it almost feels like you're the family physician as you get to see these families and kids grow up. You're seeing multiple generations of the family in a lot of instances. And then more importantly, I think in a lot of the patients that we see, you can really make a huge impact, in particular in their quality of life, and you can do it really quickly. So whether it's someone that has poorly controlled asthma or bad allergic rhinoconjunctivitis, you put them on the appropriate therapies, you see them back in a couple months, and most of the time they feel great and they're super appreciative.
Yeah, you really can make a huge difference in your patients' lives. So that really makes it a special field.
Yeah, it's really rewarding.
So we're going to talk about the National Allergy Bureau. And can you tell us a little bit about what that is and how you got involved?
Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of people don't know what the National Allergy Bureau is. I did a questionnaire about 5 or 6 years ago from fellows who had recently graduated their training programs, and there's like less than half of them had ever even heard of the National Allergy Bureau. So I'm glad we have a chance to talk about it. So it's part of the Aeroallergen network of the Quad AI. So a portion of this was actually formed a long, long time ago. So it was all the way back in 1944. At that time, the executive committee of the American Academy of Allergy, so that's what the Quad AI used to be called, the American Academy of Allergy, and now it's the Quad AI, of course. But they formed the National Pollen Survey Committee. And what they had charged themselves to do all the way back in 44 was to perform nationwide pollen counts. So that's essentially what the National Allergy Bureau does. It's responsible for standardized pollen and spore counts. It's responsible for training people to be able to accurately do this, and also collecting the data, archiving the data, and reporting the current pollen and spore counts to the media and the public. So this network from the National Allergy Bureau is really primarily made up of volunteers from all around the country, including Puerto Rico, and then other parts of the world as well. So there are several NAB stations in Argentina, Canada, and over the years there have been some in other parts of the world as well, including the UAB and in China. The process of becoming part of the National Allergy Bureau involves several different steps. So there's a certification process to be part of the network. So the first part of the certification process involves taking a certified aerobiology course. So the one that most people have experience with or familiar with is the course that's presented every year at the Quad AI annual meeting. That course has been presented annually all the way back since 1951, actually. And the course is always the first day of the annual meeting, or the day before the annual meeting starts for most of the folks that come. So it's always on Thursday. It's a day-long course from 8 until 4, where we basically teach people about how to start a pollen counting station or a spore counting station. During this course, there's parts of it that involve learning a little bit more about microscopy and folks that are not used to working with a microscope. There's lecture sessions that are involved about how to start a station, what equipment to use. We do have hands-on demonstration about how to use that particular equipment. And then a good chunk of the course involves lectures about pollen identification, about fungal spore identification, and then hands-on microscopy, where those that are signed up for the course are able to look under the scope and start learning how to accurately identify pollen and fungal spore types based on their morphology. Once people take that course, the next step to become certified involves taking a web-based multiple choice exam. And then once that is passed, there's a third step that involves taking a practical exam where we make sure that people can accurately identify what pollen they're looking at or what fungal spore they're looking at. And then if anyone is interested in that, they can always sign up for it every year for the annual meeting. It'll be going on again next year. I help teach that course. Dr. Estelle Leviton's been involved with it for years and years and years also. There's another course available for people who are super interested. It's a course at the Auctioneer Clinic in New Orleans. It's a 3-day course. It's much more in depth. It's really well run. So that's another one that's a good idea for people to look up if they're interested in starting a pollen counting station or spore counting station. And then lastly, if this interests you, but you're just not really sure you want to go to the extent of taking one of these courses right now, if you're a Quad A member, I would suggest signing up and being part of the Aerobiology Committee, where you kind of can get your toes a little bit wet and learning more about aerobiology. That's really the first step that I took out of fellowship, kind of learning how to do all of this.
So it sounds like this course, if people are excited about learning more about pollen and kind of getting a more accurate count for their area, they can sign up for this course as their first step. How do you get the equipment? Like most of places are starting from scratch. Do you talk about that in the course? What kind of equipment is best for what area?
Yep, exactly. So there's a couple different types of equipment that we use for NAB counting stations. So generally, it's one of two different types. So one is what's called a Burkhardt spore trap or a Hurst type device. This has been around since kind of post-World War II, late 1940s, 1950s. This is what most stations use for their certified counts. And we do a demonstration of this during the course, show everyone exactly how to use it. It's fairly straightforward. And then the other type of devices that are certified devices are called rotating arm impactors. The one that's most frequently seen is one that's called the rotorod. The rotorod device we also talk about during the class and how that works. There's some differences between the two. So for instance, if someone is interested in doing both pollen and spores, then the Burkhardt is the one that they should choose because the Burkhardt is better at spores, at those very small particles. Whereas if someone is just interested in doing pollen, then the rotating arm impactors are reasonable to use. How to purchase these? So the NAB as of recently, has actually been purchasing a number of Burkhardt spore traps. And if there's a new station out there that's up and running, then we can actually lend out a Burkhardt spore trap to them to get them up and running, which is a really nice, I think, opportunity for stations because there is a cost associated with these. Obviously, a Burkhardt spore trap is going to run about $2,500 if you're going to pay for it out of pocket. And then there are some automated devices as well. Those aren't necessarily certified by the NAB at this point, but if you're interested in talking about those at all, I'm happy to do that as well.
Remind us how the Burkhardt works, because I remember, again, studying it as a fellow, but I don't know that I've thought about how the exact mechanism of how it works since then.
Yeah, so this is a piece of equipment that sits up on a rooftop that should be unobstructed. There shouldn't be any like overhanging trees or anything like that. It's not like terribly heavy. It's pretty easily movable. There's a little wind vane on the back of it so that it kind of spins around so that the front of the device is always oriented in the direction of the wind. So the wind is blowing in towards it. And then on the very front, there's this really tiny little intake orifice where the airflow is able to be sucked in. There's a tiny little motor on the very bottom of the device that consistently sucks in air. So it's kind of like a little vacuum. So it sucks in air at 10 liters per minute. So you have a consistent air sampling. Inside of the device, there is a area that houses the section where you're actually collecting your air sample. So there's two different types of a Burkhardt or two different heads. One is a 24-hour sampling head where there's actually just a little greased microscope slide in there. It's attached to like an old clock that you just wind up essentially. And then that little microscope slide will slowly go past that intake orifice at 2 millimeters per hour. And then there's another head that you can put on it that's a 7-day head. So if you just want your air sampler to run for 7 full days and then make 24-hour slides out of it later, You can use this 7-day head where there's this kind of circular drum, a very thin, clear piece of tape that goes around the outside of it. It's also attached to a kind of old timepiece. You wind it up, you put it back in there, and that too will slowly turn at 2 millimeters per hour across that intake orifice. So as air is sucked in through that intake orifice, it will be impacted on the drum or the slide, and that gives you your air sample. You then go down to the lab, you stain your slides, and then you put the slides under a microscope, and then you literally just manually count all the different types of pollen or fungal spores that you see there. For the most part, all of these different pollen types have different characteristics, different morphology, different surface apertures that you can determine where that came from. Is it a birch tree? Is it grass pollen? Is it ragweed? And so on and so forth.
What are the major pollens in Nebraska right now?
So right now we're heavy into tree pollen season. So the kind of first tree pollen that we see for the most part is cedar and juniper pollen. So even in mid-February, you start seeing that tree pollen. And then it kind of moves into a little bit of maple pollen, elm pollen, hackberry pollen, and we're just kind of getting ready to get the next wave, which is going to be oak pollen, mulberry, black walnut, and then it'll probably be maybe another week or two. We'll start seeing a little bit of grass pollen.
Birch is a huge pollen up here in New England, and we see a lot of birch allergy, a lot of birch pollen, oak, maple. Those kind of things are really where we're starting to see it.
Yeah, birch certainly a very allergenic pollen.
Very much. And then when a patient wants a pollen count, what's the best place for them to get it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I always direct people to the Quad AI website. So if you go to the Quad AI website, the kind of top of the page, pretty much right in the middle, there's a little link that says check pollen counts. So you go to that, and then when the next page opens up from that link, you'll have the NAB site, and it'll have all the certified NAB stations in the United States. So I would look for the stations that is closest to your home, and you'll get the pollen count there. It'll tell you what's pollinating at the time, and generally what the pollen level is tree pollen high, medium low, grass pollen, weed pollen. And then some stations will also have fungal spore counts as well. There are other sources that people frequently go to get their pollen counts. Certainly there are websites out there. Generally speaking, we think a lot of those websites are far less accurate than the NAB certified counts. So if you're getting your pollen counts from some of those other sources, some of those other websites, I would look on the website. I would try to see where their source is for how they're deriving the pollen counts, where it's coming from. Many times you will not be able to find the source or how they're actually coming up with these pollen counts. So I would certainly take some of those with a grain of salt.
Things like the Weather Channel, how do they get their pollen counts? Is it coming from the National Allergy Bureau, or is it coming from other sites?
It's not coming from the National Allergy Bureau. It's coming from other sites. And I don't, as far as I'm aware, the Weather Channel pollen counts, it doesn't say on there where their source is. So I can't speak to it. Now, there have been some, at least abstracts that have been done comparing National Allergy Bureau sites to not necessarily the Weather Channel specifically, but some of these other sort of .coms, their pollen counts, and the abstracts that have been published show a really significant discrepancy between the certified counts and some of these others.
No, fair enough. Are there areas of the country that aren't well covered by the National Allergy Bureau?
Yeah, there are. So the National Allergy Bureau is pretty heavy coastally, East Coast, Northeast specifically, California, the Northwest. The kind of central of the United States, there is a little bit more of an absence there. We would certainly like to fill in and have a little bit more granularity throughout the entire United States. So we're always trying to get more people interested in pollen counting. We want to get as many certified sites throughout the United States as we possibly can. So we we cold call people sometimes to try to get them interested. We put little bulletins out in a lot of the Quad AI social media. And we try to get as many people interested in doing the basic aerobiology class as we can, because that's kind of really the spot where we can get more people interested and really make sure that they understand and appreciate what it is we do, how important it is, and how to get a site up and going if they would like to.
Now, are pollen levels changing over time? Are we seeing them go up, go down? What are we seeing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and there's a lot of data on this. A lot of data was presented at the most recent Quad AI World Allergy Organization Joint Congress about this particular question. So I'll talk a little bit about the data, but I also want to point out that we wouldn't have all of this data. I wouldn't be able to talk about it. We wouldn't have all these studies in regards to this question if we didn't have people out there doing pollen counts. So it's really an important thing, and we want to get more people involved so we have more robust data. But to answer your question, generally speaking, throughout the world, we're seeing increased pollen counts over time for most taxa. Now, there are certainly some instances where there are stations reporting the same or less, but for the most part, we're seeing more. And this is attributed to a number of different things. Probably of the most important is prolonged pollen seasons. And a lot of this increasing length of pollen season is attributed to longer frost-free periods. So in the United States specifically, we've really seen, kind of dating back to the 1970s, 1980s, longer pollen seasons as a result of these prolonged frost-free periods. And that's a result of the last spring frost occurring earlier each year and the first fall frost occurring later each year. So over the last 30, 40 years, generally speaking, there's been about a 2-week increase in the length of pollen season in the United States, and that's been most pronounced again in the the Northeast, and then also along the West Coast. So longer growing season, more pollen. Specifically in Omaha, over the last 25 years, we've seen more total pollen. It's about 3% per year over the last 25 years that there's an increased total pollen load during the pollen season. Outside of the length of pollen season, there's also been a lot of studies looking at how increased atmospheric CO2 is leading to increased pollen production. This increased atmospheric CO2 closely ties with anthropogenic climate change. There's been a number of studies looking at increased CO2, specifically with ragweed, and they started looking at it in growth chambers where they took ragweed, they put it in growth chambers at ambient and double ambient CO2 conditions. And the ragweed that was grown at higher CO2 conditions generally was a larger, more robust plant and produced significantly more ragweed. Those studies were followed up with less controlled studies that were done out in the normal environment, where they looked at ragweed growing in urban areas compared to rural areas, with the idea being that these urban areas are kind of heat islands where there's increased temperature, increased atmospheric CO2 compared to the rural areas. And the kind of same principle held true, that the ragweed plants grown in the urban areas produce more ragweed and were generally larger plants. There's been additional studies looking at things like what happens with increased ozone and some of these plants and what that does to pollen and to the plants specifically. So when we think about ozone, it's really helpful for us when it's in the stratosphere, that filters UVI and filters UV light and keeps us safe. But when it's at ground level, it's detrimental. When we look at what it does to plants, there are certainly some studies showing that increased ozone, specifically the birch tree pollen that we had just recently talked about, does seem to make the birch trees produce more pollen, and specifically BET-V1.
I'll put in a plug for the plenary session at the Quad AI WAO Joint Congress where they talked about this. I learned a lot about heat islands and the ragweed pollen and the effect of CO2. It was really, really impressive, the effect that we're seeing on those things.
Yeah, so there was a plenary session that was specifically devoted to this question. So one of the plenary or one of the speakers specifically talked about, how climate change is affecting all these different allergenic plants, how it's affecting increased pollen production, allergenicity potentially, in addition to prolonged, pollen seasons in general, and the data from, all this in different areas around the world. Also had talks given about how climate change is affecting pollen and how that may affect us as clinicians, and things that we may need to think about in regards to expansion of certain allergenic plants in different areas of the world that we might not necessarily think about, and how that may impact how we prescribe immunotherapy.
Absolutely. And we're seeing a lot more of these kind of extreme weather events. How is that affecting pollen levels?
Yeah, so I would not necessarily pigeonhole it specifically to pollen levels, because these extreme weather events are really affecting thousands, if not millions, of people, not just within the United States, but globally. So we think about things like these atmospheric rivers and generational flooding events, some of the extreme drought conditions, and all the wildfires throughout the western United States, and which is somewhat seems to be expanding a little bit eastward, and then even hurricanes. So last year there were two Category 5 hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, and there's only been a handful of times there's been multiple Category 5 storms in the Gulf in a single hurricane season, and the majority of those have actually been over the last decade. So these extreme weather events are impacting large portions of the population. How it affects pollen specifically, there's probably a few examples of that. So one would be like flooding events when we think about hurricanes, and the significant flooding that occurs with those, and then also non-hurricane associated inland flooding events, and how this really changes the indoor fungal spore milieu. And then the other thing that's really kind of fascinating is this idea of thunderstorm asthma. So we consider that a bit of an extreme weather event, and it's closely tied to pollen. So a lot of the thunderstorm asthma events that have occurred around the world, the majority of them have been reported in Australia and also in the UK. We haven't had any significant reports, at least capturing it in real time, that I'm aware of in the United States, but there have been a number of retrospective studies looking at this question in the United States. Atlanta was one area that they looked at. The Minneapolis area was another. Looking at days with thunderstorms and days with high pollen count, and closely tying those specific days to increased ER visits for asthma and asthma exacerbation. So it certainly may be happening here. We might not just be catching these extreme events that they're seeing in other parts of the world.
I think in Nebraska, or particularly in the Midwest, where you have these storms come through with a lot of lightning, a lot of grass pollen, you can see how those would definitely, they seem likely to be there, that we may not just be seeing the extremes that we're seeing in some places.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually really interested in that exact question. So some of the problem with trying to capture this in the state of Nebraska is that almost all the population, or the large majority of the population, is really in the very extreme eastern portion of the state. That's where kind of Omaha and Lincoln is located. So Omaha is about 1 million people, but it's really in the western half of the state is where there's a ton of grass out there. So there's what's called the Nebraska Sandhills. It's just all really open prairie. It's actually one of the most intact grasslands in the entire world. It's one of 5. So there's tons of grass pollen out there, but there's such a small population out in that area that we're not really able to capture this. But I think it's probably happening. We're just not aware of it, and it just needs some more study.
And then you mentioned, kind of flooding that we're seeing. How are mold levels changing over time?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that we probably need further research in. So most of the data looking at fungal spores and how that relates to climate change, again, has really been focused around some of these hurricanes. So it's kind of post-hurricane events that we have our data for that, and how it's directly been affected by non-extreme weather events and just kind of climate change in general over time. That's less studied. We have 70 to 80 NAB stations around the country, and it's actually a very small percentage of those that actually also count fungal spores. So we don't have as much data. The little bit of studies that have been done looking at fungal spores and climate change have primarily looked at alternaria and how alternaria is impacted by increasing atmospheric CO2 concentrations. Those were really just kind of growth chamber studies. And in those studies, it did clearly show that increasing atmospheric CO2 does significantly increase the amount of fungal spore, or the spores that the alternaria is producing.
And are there molds that people should be more concerned about than others?
The ones that I primarily think about, and this is just, kind of personal preference, if you will, is the ones that I think about causing a lot of allergy issues. So some of the dry day spores like Alternaria, Cladosporium, Epicoccum, and then the kind of other non-dry day spores, things like Aspergillus, Penicillium. Those are the ones that I'm primarily focused on. But that's not to say that there aren't countless other fungal spores that can cause allergic airway disease issues.
So across the country, we're well into pollen season, probably more into pollen season in the Midwest than we are in the Northeast. We're still on the earlier side. What are some strategies that people can use? They look up and they notice that the tree pollen is high. What are some strategies that they can use to help improve their allergy control?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that we get asked all the time by our patients. And I think some of the real basic things that people can do that are relatively easy are things like keeping your windows closed in your home. So if pollen counts high outdoors, you don't want it high inside also. We have lots of patients that this time of year it's nice and cool at night in the mornings, and they love sleeping with their windows open, and that's just really a bad idea, particularly if you have bad pollen allergy, because all that pollen is coming indoors, and some of the higher pollen counts happen in the mornings. Keeping your windows closed in your vehicles when you're going down the road. If you've been outside on a day that's a high pollen count coming in, the sooner you take a shower, rinse that pollen off, get some clean clothes on, maybe do a sinus rinse, and get all that pollen out of your nose and off those mucous membranes, the better off you're going to be. So those are really some of the basic yet tried and true strategies for prevention. And then, of course, there's always allergy immunotherapy. Allergy shots are a great way for people to be able to be outdoors and not be affected by some of the pollen without having to do all of these avoidance strategies and affect their quality of life. I just saw a patient the other day. He was a young guy. I think he was like a 1-year follow-up. And when I first saw him, he told me that he loves golfing. He loves being outside playing baseball with his kids and going for runs and doing yard work. But he's just miserable every spring, and he can't go out and do any of that stuff because his symptoms were so bad. And came back. He's been on allergy shots for a year. He just was profusely, his gratitude for how much better he feels after being on allergy shots. He's able to go out and do all this stuff now and not feel miserable. So that's always something that we have in our back pocket as allergists that can really help people as well.
Yeah, no, when those patients come back who have really had this success from immunotherapy, it's really incredible what they're able to then go out and do in the midst of the high pollen season.
Yeah, I'm still, I've been at this for quite a while now, and it still amazes me how effective immunotherapy is for patients when done properly, and the patients are just so satisfied with it. It's really one of the reasons that I also went into allergy. Going through internal medicine residency, all these chronic medical conditions, and we just pile more and more and more medications on people, which is necessary in a lot of these instances. But immunotherapy is one way that we can start taking away medications from people. So, you have patients come in that are on multiple oral antihistamines a day, and Singulair and topical corticosteroids and topical antihistamines and allergy eye drops and so on and so forth, and they're still miserable. And you get them on allergy shots and they feel great, and you're able to take away all those meds.
No, absolutely. We have a personal experience in our house. My husband's very allergic to cats, and my kids wanted cats, and he did allergen immunotherapy, and we now have 3 cats who are everywhere, and he is not miserable and not taking the all the medications that he was taking to try to survive. Our kids' love of cats, so
I love
they
it.
work.
Everyone goes happy. There goes home
Everyone's
happy.
happy. And so talking about pollen allergies, in allergy, we see kids, we see adults. When do we start to think about pollen allergies in kids?
When we think of pollen allergy, really for the most part, people need to have, several seasons of exposure to that particular pollen most of the time before they become sensitized. So, whether it's a really young child, a year or two of age, usually they're not going to have pollen allergies yet because they need to have repeated exposure over several seasons. Same thing applies to someone, maybe moving from one part of the country to the other where there's a new allergen that they haven't previously had exposure to. They usually need a few seasons for it. So for kids, we're thinking for pollen allergy, at least for the most part, you're thinking age 2 or greater. So kind of age 2 to 10, maybe something like that. But I would say when we really start seeing at least more symptomatic pollen allergy pickup, you're probably looking more at like adolescence into the 20s for the most part.
And then do allergies get better as people age?
Well, that's the fun thing about allergy, right? So it's really unpredictable. So whether we're talking about, pollen allergy and pollenosis or food allergy or drug allergy, it's truly unpredictable. So, some people, their pollens or their allergies, seasonal allergies might get worse as they age. For some people, they might get better. So it's a little bit random, I would say, to some degree, though. If we think about patients who have had seasonal allergies, maybe by the time they're in their 60s, 70s, immune system starts changing a little bit. And maybe around that age, it's a little bit more common to start seeing some of the seasonal allergy symptoms maybe start to fade a little bit. But at the same time, I still have patients, in their 80s. And yeah, I'm thinking of a 93-year-old guy right now that I still see with asthma and allergies, and he is still very symptomatic with seasonal allergies. I re-skin tested him because he hadn't been tested for about 20 years because I didn't think it was, it was allergic rhinitis. I was thinking it was probably more non-allergic. And sure enough, that guy just had huge skin prick test reactions to all sorts of different pollen. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag.
Absolutely. And then how did the levels of air pollution affect people with allergies?
Yeah, this is an area of research that's ongoing. So I'll hit on a few things. So one is the increased ozone that I briefly talked about. So there's been a couple studies looking at this. So one big study looked at ozone exposure to birch pollen ozone exposure throughout kind of the Munich area. So they took a bunch of birch pollen, they collected the catkins from kind of rural areas up into urban areas. And then they also measured the amount of BET-V1 from each of those different birch trees and basically showed that as there's increasing ozone, there's more BET-V1 that's being produced from those birch trees. So some of that work needs to be reproduced. There were other studies looking at tree pollen that's been collected from really high pollution areas. So essentially like right next to like busy highways. And then they took that pollen, they made skin testing extracts out of it, and skin tested patients that were known to be allergic to that particular pollen. And the pollen from the high pollution area produced significantly larger wound flares compared to that from the low pollution area. They did some other kind of RAS inhibition studies also showing it to essentially be more allergenic. There have also been some work looking at kind of similar things in mouse models, looking at ragweed that have been grown at double ambient CO2 conditions and what that does in a mouse model, and showing that the high ragweed CO2 or the high CO2 ragweed really increased the amount of Th2 cytokines in the mouse compared to just kind of traditional low CO2 ragweed. So those are a few studies that have been looked at. There's also been some work done looking at diesel exhaust particles, other pollution, and how it affects the respiratory epithelium, and maybe some of that pollution actually causes some damage and likely does cause some damage to that airway epithelium, increasing the kind of local inflammatory milieu there, which then may increase the chance that people become sensitized. Kind of a similar concept to eczema. If you have, a damaged skin barrier, you increase sensitization through that. So it's kind of like a double hit, I guess, if you will, with damaged airway epithelium, increasing inflammatory reaction at the site, and then maybe that pollen itself also being changed somewhat, or perhaps become more allergenic due to the pollution itself. So a double hit, if you will.
So maybe similar to how we think of viral infections and asthma, kind of damaging the airway epithelium, causing inflammation, making people more likely to flare. Similar, possibly with pollution and its effect on the airway epithelium.
Yep, exactly right.
Perfect. Well, great. I would just like to put in another plug for people to get involved with the National Allergy Bureau if they're interested, and hopefully they could maybe reach out to you if they were excited to learn how to pollen count and what is involved in that. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Is there anything you would like to add before we go, or any take-home points you want to make sure that everyone takes away with them?
I thank you so much for having me on this podcast again. I'm always happy to talk about the NAB and aerobiology. I think what's going on with aeroallergens and climate change is really fascinating and something that we certainly need more research to be done and to keep our eye on. Anytime someone is interested in the NAB or becoming certified, please reach out to me, arorie@unmc.edu. They can also directly reach out to the NAB@quadai.org.
That's great. Thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed listening to today's episode. As a reminder, this podcast is not intended to provide any individual medical advice to our listeners. We do hope that our conversations provide evidence-based information. Any questions about one's own health should always be discussed with their physician. The Find an Allergist search engine on the Academy website is a useful tool to locate a list of board-certified allergists in your area. Use of this audio program is subject to the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology Terms of Use Agreement, which you can find on our website. Please visit quadai.org for show notes and any pertinent links from today's conversation, including how to access current pollen levels. If you like this show, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast in whatever podcast app you use so you can receive new episodes in the future. Thank you again for listening.